Well, thank you for joining us to discuss the order granting 22 states and the District of Columbia's motion for a preliminary injunction which prohibits the federal government from continuing to freeze funds to states for monies that were already appropriated by Congress. With me today are my special assistant, David Day. He's going to provide some information about the specific harms experienced here in Hawaii. And Kaliko Fernandez, our Solicitor General. She's going to be able to provide a primer on the law to help everyone understand what a preliminary injunction is and why the court decided to issue today's injunction. Before I start, I do want to make sure everybody in the state recognizes the amazing support that my department has received. Governor Green has been supportive of all of the work we're doing, and his support has been indispensable. I also want to thank the lawmakers. The legislature has made it clear from day one that they will support all of our efforts to enforce the rule of law. So today, the District Court of the District of Rhode Island fulfilled its role in our form of government by interpreting and applying the law passed by Congress. On January 27th, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, issued a memo instructing all federal agencies to temporarily pause all activities related to the obligation or disbursement of federal financial assistance, including funds already appropriated by Congress. Purportedly, this memo was to carry out the policies of the new president based on the executive orders he issued beginning shortly after his inauguration. These already allocated and appropriated funds affected Medicaid, special education, free and reduced cost meals for children, mental health and substance abuse treatment, heating and power for low-income residents, and it included monies that were appropriated through the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which included programs like broadband access, reliability of the electric grid, and clean water. On January 28th, 22 states and the District of Columbia, represented by all Democratic Attorneys General, filed a lawsuit seeking a temporary restraining order to prevent the OMB from enforcing its memo. The hearing was scheduled for January 29th. Just prior, I guess shortly before the hearing, the defendants provided a notice to the court stating that the OMB memo had been rescinded. So all of the complaints or the concerns set forth in the complaint by the attorneys general were moot. During the hearing, however, the states were able to provide evidence to the court in the form of the White House press secretary's announcement on X that while the OMB memo was rescinded, the federal funding freeze was not rescinded and the president's EOs remained in full force and effect. The court ultimately determined that the OMB memo rescission did not stop the funding freeze, and the judge issued the TRO. A hearing on the preliminary injunction was held on February 14th, and the order was issued this morning. Before I turn this over to Dave and Kaliko to help us understand more, I want to reference a couple of passages in this order that I think are critical for all of us to remember. The court wrote that here the executive put itself above Congress, and he provided an excellent civics lesson, reminding all readers that the three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, derive their powers from the United States Constitution. And they function together. One branch's power does not supersede another's. Then he quoted James Madison from the Federalist, number 47, writing in part that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands would pose an inherent threat to liberty. This is why the Democratic Attorneys General are working collaboratively and collectively to ensure that the rule of law is not lost in the midst of this administration's chaotic efforts to dismantle government. I'm finished with that. I'd like Dave to come on up and talk a little bit about what's happened in Hawaii.
Thank you, Attorney General Lopez. The Department of the Attorney General is committed to ensuring that state departments and agencies receive the federal funds to which they are entitled by law, and we are extremely grateful to Governor Josh Green and his administration for their support in helping us achieve this result today. The people of Hawaii pay billions of dollars in federal taxes every year and are entitled to receive the benefit of the social compact we have with our federal government. During the process of this litigation, we received assistance from Hawaii agencies that continue to have federal accounts frozen or subjected to so-called holds, quote unquote, which required a manual review of any drawdown of some nominal amount, often $1. As an example of such a funding freeze, the Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority had over $60 million in federal funds frozen in a suspended account for a program called Solar for All, run through the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. This $60 million was appropriated by Congress to provide solar power for low-income properties, specifically here for people in Hawaii. No explanation was given by the EPA for the reason for the suspension of the account, but it was only through this litigation, that this funding stream for Solar for All has now been reopened. But many others remain suspended or subjected to a hold, waiting for federal government action of an unknown duration, even as of this week, despite a temporary restraining order and an order specifically enforcing the temporary restraining order issued by a United States District Court judge. We thank all of our departments and agencies, including the Department of Land and Natural Resources, the Hawaii State Energy Office, the University of Hawaii, and the Department of Law Enforcement in identifying numerous funding streams or contracts that continue to be impaired. And I'd also like to thank Deputy Attorneys General Miranda Steed and Danica Swenson for their work specifically with DLNR on identifying funding streams that continue to be impaired to this day. The grants we identified include money for clean energy, forest stewardship, the protection of endangered species, homeland security, port security, among other things that we hope will be reopened as a result of this preliminary injunction being issued. In the past week or so, FEMA has subjected its grants to the state of Hawaii, to holds, and are continuing to be hold as of this day. The federal government took the position that holds are not subject to a freeze. The district court today stated otherwise. These grants relate to cybersecurity, homeland security, port security, and terrorism prevention. Because of this order, FEMA will have until next Friday, March 14th, to demonstrate that it is complying with the preliminary injunction order. And we look forward to seeing compliance with respect to these funding streams and the others we have identified. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Solicitor General Calico Fernandez.
Thank you, A.G. Lopez, and thank you to Dave Day, Special Assistant. So as A.G. Lopez mentioned, the plaintiff states here sought and obtained a preliminary injunction from the district court. And what the court did is bar the defendants from implementing the directives in the OMB memo and from pausing, freezing, blocking, canceling, suspending, terminating, or otherwise impeding the disbursement of appropriated federal funds to the states under awarded grants, executed contracts, or other executed financial obligations based on the OMB memo or any other similar directive. The court found that the states, as required to obtain a preliminary injunction, were likely to succeed on their claims under what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA. The states argued, among other things, that the funding freezes were contrary to law and arbitrary and capricious. The court explained that rather than taking a deliberative, thoughtful approach, the defendants abruptly froze billions of dollars of federal funding for an indefinite period. It is difficult to perceive any rationality in this decision, let alone thoughtful consideration of practical consequences when the funding pauses endanger the state's ability to provide vital services, including but not limited to public safety, health care, education, childcare, and transportation infrastructure. The court also noted that the harms to the states from funds not flowing as promised is so obvious that it almost need not be stated, and that it is the state citizens, often our most vulnerable citizens, who are enduring much of the harm. And really here, the court emphasized the distinct constitutional roles of the various branches of government, and that through categorically freezing congressionally appropriated and obligated funds, the executive, as Attorney General Lopez mentioned, put itself above Congress. Thank you.
Questions? I do want to note that Danica Swenson and Miranda Steed, who are the deputies who have been working with us, are here. And I also want to thank them for their work. This is, for everybody to understand, this is all in addition to the work we're already doing. And so people have really taken their own personal time to make sure we could participate in this litigation.
If I can ask a question, it's quite confusing to the agencies, let alone the public, about how sweeping this particular order is versus the other injunctions that have been issued for other things, and then the other things we're hearing, for example, from UH about the overhead limit on their grants. So how sweeping is this? I mean, should we see all of these sources coming back, or are there still other fights to be had?
UH, through the Cancer Center, JABSOM, and its other research departments, has about $211 million in grants. Their indirect costs are based on a percentage of 56%. So if the indirect costs were reduced to 15%, the delta is how much they would be losing. Those monies are used to pay for buildings, heating, equipment, all of the things necessary to pursue the research that they do. I want to also point out that the Democratic AGs filed that lawsuit against the NIH to stop that reduction. No Republican attorneys general have joined us in that lawsuit or any other, notwithstanding the fact that, for example, Texas receives just shy of $2 billion in NIH grants. Its losses would have been huge, as even compared to Hawaii. So the work that we're doing is being benefited by all of the people of the United States, not just Hawaii.
So the NIH directive, in the paper today, I read that there was an order yesterday that lifted that one. And that's different from the one that we're talking about today, which is the freezes and holds.
Well, there's two. There's the NIH preliminary injunction that was issued, I think, yesterday?
Yesterday.
So that one was issued yesterday, and that affects the entire United States.
Okay.
And then today, the preliminary injunction is based on specifically the OMB memo that came out on January 27th, which caused a huge amount of chaos throughout the United States. I think you probably all reported that the next morning, Medicaid couldn't access any of its funds. Head Start, early Head Start couldn't access their funds. Everything was shut down. And basically the federal government, they weren't answering their phones. So nobody knew what was happening at that time.
So the NIH injunction is for all states, but the injunction on the 22 states for the hold and the freeze that you were talking about today is only for the 22 states, is that correct?
And the District of Columbia,
And the District
correct.
of Columbia. So when money flows through a grant holding in some other state, and are we still gonna see some things being held up? The confusion is that some things are held up and some things aren't, and some things are coming through other states. So I'm wondering, will we still see these pockets of refusals by the federal government?
In the state of Hawaii, we should not.
And then what do you do about that, if that happens?
if it happens, if they are not following
Yeah.
the order. That will certainly require us to take further action. I believe that the order issued today was clear and he provided a civics lesson on how our government works. If the federal government doesn't adhere to this order, then we will have to go back to the district court and go back to the judiciary. And I believe, and can only believe, that they will rule in a way that maintains our form of government with three co-equal branches.
What would you ask for as a sanction or something to enforce this?
I'm not going to answer that question. It's kind of a hypothetical, and that would be something that the attorneys general would talk about and make a decision.
Well, so today's order takes effect immediately,
Yes.
so as of today, they need
Yes.
to be back in the job.
Pardon
You
me?
need to be getting the money.
Yes, everybody should have access to their federal funds. We have not had much of a chance to reach out to anybody yet, our state agencies, to see if they have access or don't have access, but we'll be doing that throughout the day.
Do we have any idea of the ballpark number of just how much federal funding is included in this particular order?
I don't have the specific amount, but I can say that 20% of the state's budget comes from the federal government in the form of these categorical appropriations and grants that are appropriated by Congress.
So in summary, how would you describe what this means? I mean, just what this means to everyone?
I personally am very, very excited. When I took this job, I had no idea that this would be a part of what I was doing. It's new to all of us. We've jumped into this fight, and it's been, I think, 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks now. We have all worked hard and tirelessly, and I believe through and through that protecting the rule of law is our most important task right now, today, and the Democratic Attorneys General and our staffs are the only government officials who are making that a priority right now.
Can you give us a summary of what other lawsuits you're involved with now? These two are not the only ones, right?
That's correct. We have one lawsuit that was filed against the Department of Government Efficiency when they received access to the U.S. Treasury. That access allowed them access to the personal identifying information of tens of thousands and millions of American residents and citizens. That is currently subject to a preliminary injunction as well. We have the birthright citizenship case. That one was filed, I believe, the day after inauguration, or the next day. And in that case, that addressed the president's executive order trying to end birthright citizenship. We filed that case with the attorneys general and the district, including the District of Columbia. That case is currently being appealed by the federal government in the First Circuit.
So you've actually managed to win at each level, the first rounds in this fight. But when you look at the size of the federal government, the resolve of President Trump, and the complete support of Congress that he seems to have, do you feel sometimes like this is futile?
I don't think it is. I think at the end of the day, our form of government is going to stand up and be strong. The political winds are obviously blowing in a particular direction that certainly makes me nervous at times, but we've endured for over 200 years, and I believe that we will continue to, provided that people like the attorneys general participate in these lawsuits and make every effort that we can to push back against the efforts of the president. And I would love to invite all of the attorneys general in all of the states to help us enforce the rule of law. This is not a political opinion, this is the rule of law.
Is there any discussion about pursuing a lawsuit in the case of the DOE being dismantled and other agencies?
At this point, I can't answer that. I think we've probably all seen the draft executive order that I believe might have been leaked, because I don't think it's been issued yet. So we have not had any conversations about that at this point.
And just to argue the other side, the federal government is too large, so there is a need to cut back on some of these initiatives and agencies.
I don't think anybody argues with that. I will tell you that the Office of the Inspector General for the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, they, as for my experience in dealing with healthcare for the last 15 years, they are looking for fraud and abuse every single day. They require constant documentation from hospitals and healthcare providers to ensure that all of the monies that have been appropriated and are being used have in fact been earned or used in the way that they were meant to be. All of us as government officials should be looking for fraud and abuse. That's inherently part of our job in running good government. And I don't have any problem with us making that examination of our programs. What happened here, however, is the funding freeze was across the board. There was clearly no effort to look at a program and say, does this program suffer from poor management or people using monies fraudulently? It was just across the board on the assumption that the federal government is too large and waste and abuse is happening everywhere. Elon Musk has continued that theme, and without ever once having come out to say, we looked at this particular agency and this is what we found. Instead, they say, we looked at this agency and we believe there's billions of dollars that are being wasted, but there's no facts that support any of those statements.
I know you're gonna consider this a hypothetical question, you maybe not wanna answer it, but given the obstinance of the federal government, the ability that they have to hide their decisions and stop funds, because they're the check writers, right? If indeed this continues, do you see the state having to backfill in areas with state funds where you've got, say, people who are in trials or plants that need to be taken care of or other things that are literally spoiling on the shelf for lack of money? Do you see looking ahead and saying, okay, we've got some money we can front to some of these highly dire situations?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things happening all at once right now. So the efforts that we're participating in are about monies that have already been appropriated by Congress. I think everybody's aware that on March 14th, the continuing resolution to operate the federal government ends. So at that point, if Congress doesn't come to some sort of consensus on how to proceed, we would anticipate that the government would shut down. And how that would affect us, I would leave to the Governor Green and Louis Salaveria. The next step, though, is on October 1st, is the first day of the federal government's fiscal year. That will be President Trump's budget. And so we all have to be thinking very closely about what kind of federal funds we receive, how they're used, and begin to prioritize programs. That is happening throughout the executive branch. The governor requested that all of the departments go through that exercise of identifying the funds they have, what they're used for, and what the priorities are for the
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you. based on a percentage of 56%. So if the indirect costs were reduced to 15%, the delta is how much they would be losing. Those monies are used to pay for buildings, heating, equipment, all of the things necessary to pursue the research that they do. I want to also point out that the Democratic AGs filed that lawsuit against the NIH to stop that reduction. No Republican attorneys general have joined us in that lawsuit or any other, notwithstanding the fact that, for example, Texas receives just shy of $2 billion in NIH grants. Its losses would have been huge, as even compared to Hawaii. So the work that we're doing is being benefited by all of the people of the United States, not just Hawaii.
So the NIH directive, in the paper today, I read that there was an order yesterday that lifted that one. And that's different from the one that we're talking about today, which is the freezes and holds.
Well, there's two. There's the NIH preliminary injunction that was issued, I think, yesterday?
Yesterday.
So that one was issued yesterday, and that affects the entire United States.
Okay.
And then today, the preliminary injunction is based on specifically the OMB memo that came out on January 27th, which caused a huge amount of chaos throughout the United States. I think you probably all reported that the next morning, Medicaid couldn't access any of its funds. Head Start, early Head Start couldn't access their funds. Everything was shut down. And basically the federal government, they weren't answering their phones. So nobody knew what was happening at that time.